7 months ago today, on July 1st, my husband and I moved to Vancouver. And we knew a little bit about what to expect. We knew that it was going to be beautiful. Vancouver is famous for being situated between the mountains and the oceans, and we have all these beautiful green spaces around us. We knew that Vancouver is famous for the rain. We knew to expect that there would be plenty of rain and that we would probably not be able to go a day without being in conversation with someone about Vancouver traffic. We knew that this is the Hollywood North, that there are all kinds of films and TV shows that are filmed and produced here. And we knew it was the home of the Canucks, the Vancouver Canucks. But what no one talks about, and probably what no one else other than nerds like myself who got graduate degrees in educational psychology think about, is that it is also the home of a local psychologist who focuses on developmental and clinical psychology. He's one of the most foremost researchers on attachment theory, and that is Dr. Gordon Neufeld, is a local to Vancouver. And I think we should add this to the cool things we say about Vancouver, because this guy is truly world-renowned. And I was able to attend a seminar this past fall of his where he was presenting on the topic of bullying. And it really changed the way that I think about this topic. And so I'm going to be referencing a lot of his work today as we dive into the first part of this series on relationships. And before those of you who don't have children start to tune out a little bit, I want to stop you and say, please don't hang in there with us, because the truth of the matter is that bullies grow up. They're in your workplace. They're in the grocery line in front of you. They're in our government. They're in our church settings. They are probably going to show up at the next holiday family gathering that you have. It's harsh, but it's true. Bullies grow up. And the fact of the matter is, there has always been those who prey on the weak and the vulnerable. And in this day and age, bullying has become a mainstream dynamic. And so Dr. Neufeld says that there are 4 prevailing expectations for bullying. These are kind of the 4 general ideas that people have when they think about bullying and why kids, adults, why individuals become bullies. And the first one is that it's a power imbalance problem. That the idea that at its root, bullying is a power difference between two people, and if we could just even the playing field, get rid of that power differential, then the bullying behavior would just go away. The second is a very common one, and that is that it's a behavior or a learning problem of some kind. Oh, they just never learned how to behave. Or they just act out because they're weak students. We interpret everything as a behavioral issue, not an emotional issue. Well, let me tell you that as a teacher and now as a principal, I am firmly convinced that there is not a single behavioral trouble that doesn't have emotional roots. And so does Dr. Neufeld, and he's the expert. The third thing that people often talk about is that it's just a human values problem. Some people really believe if we could just instill better values in an individual, that would just fix the issue. That values are supposed to temper our impulses. And the last one is the one that we probably hear the most often, and that is that bullying is really about social skills, or it's really an empathy problem. All children would be nice if they just knew how. But actually, bullies don't really have an empathy problem at all. If empathy can be described as recognizing the vulnerability in another human, bullies are actually empathy professionals. The problem is that coupled with a lack of caring, a bully manipulates that vulnerability. Bullies don't feel conflicted. The worst thing that you can do is tell someone with a mean streak how you're feeling and how the things that they're saying and doing hurt you. The last thing that a bully needs is to know how they are making the bully feel. A bully will exploit that vulnerability and use it to inflict damage. There's been some studies gathered by the National Association of School Psychologists in the States, and they report that nearly 20% of children in grades 6 to 10 have either been bullied, or a similar number admit that they have been engaging in bullying behaviors, taking part in bullying. And in fact, other studies that I found put that number at actually closer to 50%. And when we think about the bullying programs that we have in our schools, we see curriculum that is operating under the assumption that caring exists. And the thing about that is that you can't tutor caring, right? There's no flashcards for it, but we are all capable of it. And so Dr. Neufeld says that there is what he calls the bullying equation. And this is how it goes. The making of a bully, according to him, is that if an individual is highly moved to displace, which means that they have a need to be on top, to be first, if they're highly moved to displace, and we add a lack of feelings of caring, responsibility, that equals the need to assert dominance by exploiting vulnerability. That's the bully response. And this is how it works. Our bodies are made to bounce between stress and resilience. We experience something stressful, our body initiates a stress response, and that inhibits our feelings, anything that might interfere with performing or functioning in those stressful circumstances. And we see this sometimes in survivors of trauma or those that have PTSD. The brain basically says, we can't afford to feel, right? What is supposed to happen, though, is that after the initial stress response, our stress starts to diminish over time, and our feelings are able to bounce back. This is called the resilience response. But if conditions are not conducive for feelings to bounce back, that stress response actually gets stuck, and the feelings that have been inhibited aren't able to bounce back. And stress with the absence of feeling spells trouble. Think about what most of us do when we get stressed. Maybe we get home, or we're even on our commute on the way home, and we call a friend or a family member, and we say, "You will never believe the day that I had. First of all, he said this, and then that happened, and then that meeting, and then my computer glitched, and you just can't believe everything that went on today." But at the end of the day, you're able to bounce back. But some people are losing their feelings because there is no end of day for them to get their feelings back and allow that stress to diminish. And when a kid or even an adult, someone loses their ability to feel, they lose their empathy. You can have emotions and not necessarily feel them. There's a legend around the samurai warriors of Japan that in addition to the characteristics of discipline and loyalty and the ability to wield two swords at once, that if they could not feel sadness at loss, then they could not become samurai. These fierce fighters had to be in their feels, and they couldn't cut themselves off from their feelings. So bullying at its core is really an emotional problem, characterized by being stuck in that stress mode where our feelings are defensively inhibited, where they're defended against feeling. And the Bible doesn't address bullying specifically. You won't find anywhere in the book of Genesis a line that said, and Joseph's brothers bullieth him, right? That doesn't mean, though, that we can't use biblical principles
when we talk about this issue, or that there isn't example after example over and over again in the stories of the scriptures. But first, let's go back to the part of the bullying equation, the first part, that bullies are moved to displace. There's a couple of common displacement instincts, and we see them all around us, right? To take charge, to take over, to take the lead, to talk louder, talk over, talk for another, to talk, to be first, to be the best, to be on top, to demand deference, to give orders, to take command. And sometimes we call these instincts leadership. And that is a whole topic for another sermon. But the problem becomes when these traits marry a lack of feeling. When you look at bullies and their childhood, it was not safe for them to depend. And the sons of Jacob are actually a perfect example of this. We find this Bible story in Genesis 37. We have Jacob, a man with 2 wives, really 4, and he has 12 sons. And the second youngest is named Joseph, and he is clearly Jacob's favorite, born of the favorite wife. And the older brothers, the 10 older brothers, resent him for this favoritism. They see it, and they resent it. And Joseph, in addition to being the favorite, he's a little bit of a dreamer. And so he will have a dream and run quickly to tell his brothers and his family, I had a dream, and there was these grain sheaves, and they were all bowing to one. Or I had a dream, and the sun and the moon and the stars were bowing to me. So this didn't win him any favors with these brothers who were already resentful. It probably wasn't even very popular with Dad. What? The sun, the moon bowing to you? What? But he continued, obviously, to share these things with his family. And so at one point in the story, Jacob, the father, sends the 10 older brothers to Shechem with their herds of sheep. And after a while, hadn't heard anything, and so decided to send Joseph to check on them. And they see him coming from a long way off, and the grumbling starts, and someone gets this crazy idea. Why don't we grab him and throw him in a pit? And this was intending to let him die, right? This is a plot, basically, to kill their younger brother. So they throw him in a pit, intending to let him die, but they see later a group of Midianite merchants headed to Egypt. And so they decide to sell him as a slave. So their position as beloved sons was highly dependent on who their mother was and whether she happened to be pregnant at the time. They could not depend on their father's love or their mother's happiness or their place in the family. And when their baby brother, Joseph, threatened the little sense of order or place that they had, when there was even a sense that somehow he might end up on top, maybe even taking command of them, they threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. You see, they were defending against depending. They had lost all feeling of caring and responsibility for their family. It was the perfect bullying equation. But here's the thing, bullying is not in the genes. Although some could argue that their grandpa Laban, even their dad, did have some bullying tendencies. But if a bully can be made, given the right conditions, they can be unmade. If at least one of the 2 variables in this equation can be removed, we no longer have a bullying response. We don't actually know all that went on with Joseph's brothers after he left for Egypt. We have snippets of their stories, and we can kind of piece together a picture of their lives post selling their brother into slavery. Take Judah, for example, son number 4. Just after this whole sell your brother into slavery and break the heart of your aging father deal, the Bible tells us in Genesis 38 that Judah gets married and he has 3 sons. And he clearly loves them very much. And in fact, we can tell from the story that he's quite protective of them. This is good for Judah because we have some feelings happening here. Feelings of tenderness, caring, a sense of responsibility for his family. His 2 older sons and his wife die, and he is immersed in grief. The Bible actually uses this word grief specifically. This is also good. I mean, not obviously that his family is dying, that's not the good part, but he can feel sadness at the loss of his family. In the midst of that grief, though, he makes some pretty poor decisions. He gets himself into a situation where he has to depend on someone else, his daughter-in-law. And he has to depend on her, really, to make a very tricky situation right. A situation that probably caused him to feel a lot of feelings, maybe of guilt, of embarrassment, shame even. Here, we've got a bully being unmade, feeling his feelings and having to depend on someone else. In fact, later in the story, spoiler alert if you haven't read it, he puts his life on the line for his other half-brother that was birthed by his Aunt Rachel, Joseph's brother Benjamin. And I think that his turnaround happened because he was no longer able to defend against depending and feeling. We know the bullies from the beginning of time practically have been with us. But if you can feel, you can avoid that bully response. So the 2 main interventions for bullying are make it safe to depend and make it safe to feel. In essence, we have to create the same environmental conditions that God provides for us, that God offers to us. Think about the relationship between God and man that we probably have the most detailed written record about. The writings of David, who is a man after God's own heart. The most famous biblical passage that David authored, perhaps, is Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. It's difficult for us to know exactly what was happening during the writing of the 23rd Psalm. There are those that will tell you that this psalm was written while David was a youth tending sheep because it's very much a shepherd's psalm. However, there are some scholars that think that this was not the case. For example, in verse 5, he was old enough to have enemies. And it sounds like more than just the lion or the bear coming after the sheep. In verse 4, he was facing the danger of death. In verse 3, he was experiencing rest. And again in verse 5, he was experiencing prosperity. These things all point to someone who has probably reached maturity, reached adulthood. And it is possible that the 23rd Psalm was written while David's army was in the midst of a civil war against the army of his son, Absalom. Now, of course, obviously, David is grief-stricken and he is heartbroken. And it was probably the darkest hour of his life when he wrote the words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Psalm 23 is the ultimate picture of healthy dependence and attachment. Was David safe? No, he wasn't. But he felt safe because he knew that he could trust and depend on God. And clearly, we know that he felt some things, right? Psalm seems like an emotional roller coaster of David's highs and lows. Certainly, he had a place to feel his feelings at the end of the day. He felt that he could go to God and express the things that he was feeling. We all need a time and a place for our feelings to catch up. By the way, do you want to know one of the best ways to feel? Music. Yeah. We know, obviously, that David had this idea because he was a prolific songwriter and musician. And it's no coincidence, I think, here that we worship with music, that we are provided with a place to feel. Schools with choirs have the best level of mental health because students have a venue to feel and to express emotion through music. So if we go back to the 4 prevailing explanations for bullying, we can see that it all comes down to a matter of feeling. The problem is not developing social skills in your neighborhood bully. Behavior and apparent moral problems are fueled by underlying emotional problems. And a power imbalance, hierarchy is the answer, not the problem. Bullies need someone in authority that they can depend upon. So what it comes down to is this: right relationships and soft hearts. Bullies need to be in trusting, dependent relationships and have the ability to feel their emotions. If we can't help to create these variables in the lives of the children and even the adults around us, there is no hope for the bully. It's not about having the answer, it's actually about being the answer. And this means a lot of listening. This means providing a place for others to feel their feelings, to bounce back from the stress response. This means developing relationships with kids and teens in this church. The number 1 contributing factor to positive mental health in teens is a positive attachment to an adult who feels responsible for them. Bullying is virtually non-existent in communities and cultures where there is a cascading chain of care, meaning that older are taking care of younger, and those younger are taking care of those even younger than them. We are built, God has designed us as creatures of togetherness. We know that even looking in the model of the Trinity, right? We are made for community. And we need to bring back the dignity in dependence. We live in a world that tells you that you can do everything by yourself, that you don't need anyone else. But we need to bring back that culture of dependence and care for one another. We need each other. So now you kind of know how to fight right when it comes to bullies. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to contribute to the unmaking or even prevent the making of a bully? The last time we hear from Judah in the Bible, his father blessed him and his brothers, and his brother Joseph, the one that he wronged in such a big and life-altering way, had forgiven him. And we know that later, through his line of descendants, would come Jesus Christ, the Lion of Judah. And you know, I have to say that that is a pretty big turnaround for someone who was just someone's bully of a brother.